Deep Sky Magazine Audiobooks presents The Docking Marshal by Rob Whitelock. Bryn Turgid leaned back in a filthy, nicotine-stained chair, narrowed his eyes and sucked long and hard on his roach. He blew out a jet of indigo-coloured smoke that rolled over the control console. Every year, he promised himself that he'd push himself to look for another gig, and every year, he welched on the deal. Being a docking marshal was a tedious job that carried none of the kudos of station crew or the sex appeal of flight crew. And everything had been made more complicated by the accident. At least he could wear his own clothes to work. That particular uniform currently consisted of a vest that used to be white, greasy dungarees that had enough oil on them to facilitate a sump change, and a trucker's hat perched on the back of a head that was beginning to lose its hair. This last point was bothering him. There was no way he could afford the kind of prices that the clinics charge for restoration. He'd considered razoring it off completely, but didn't feel ready for the transition to full bald just yet. He'd opted for a crop. It was a good halfway house before taking it all the way to skin. The booth that Turgid sat in was positioned high above the Hyperion station's 4 landing bays. It was a squalid little glass cube that was littered with bits of broken biscuit, fast food wrappers, discarded socks, and was covered in a thin layer of assorted crumbs. This was all against regulations, of course, but as the auditors rarely got out this far, he only ever had to do a clean-up once a year to keep the company off his back. The rest of the time, his personal fiefdom could go to shit, and Curly couldn't have cared less what he did in there. Curly was the station director, which made him sound a lot more important than he actually was. He and Turgid were the only 2 human staff aboard the Hyperion, and while technically that made him his boss, neither of them stood on ceremony. Curly had been promoted way over his ability, but when you were the nephew of one of the iron oligarchs, you could pretty much choose whatever gig you wanted. The unspoken deal was that Turgid took care of business down here and put his feet up when he felt like it, while Curly stayed on the executive deck up on the penthouse level, chatting to AI sex workers and whacking off. It was an arrangement that suited them both. Since the accident, they owed each other a debt of silence. It hadn't been Turgid's fault. The AI was being moody that day and refusing to run its guidance software. Luckily, there had only been the pilot aboard the shuttle at the time. Curly had agreed that it was best they fired the body out of the airlock and forgot all about it. The story would be that the shuttle had been lost in space. Simple as that. Happened all the time. They both had too much to lose. Nobody would have to know. It was their secret. The Hyperion station had been a waypoint for ships heading out of the local cluster, but in recent years had solely become a jump-off point for the mining vessels that were ferrying workers backwards and forwards to the exoplanets of Barnard's Star. The rest of the trade had slowly drifted to the far groovier Oceanus station just beyond the Oort cloud. The smug fucks had used a combination of diplomacy and underhand tactics to slowly snag most of the business at this end of the solar system. The old Earth mining companies, conservative and stuck in their ways, were the only ones keeping Hyperion in the game. Turgid scratched his nuts through the thick denim, brushed the fag ash off his crotch with the back of his hand, and decided that the roach was worth one more pull before it would scorch his lips. Pinching it carefully between thumb and forefinger, he pulled on it for one final drag, then jabbed it repeatedly into the edge of the console, alongside similar-looking burn marks. He then dropped it into an overflowing ashtray, knocking over a tall glass of tepid tea as he withdrew his hand. "Oh, shit," he said, as the liquid quickly ran amongst the buttons and dripped down onto his trousers that similarly bore the stains of previous liquid mishaps. He grabbed at a roll of toweling that he kept ready for such occasions and dabbed, clumsily, at the pools of spilt tea. His belt radio chirped. He quickly ditched the soaked towel in the trash and grabbed at the handset. Docking Marshal, Hyperion 1, what's your status, over?
Docking Marshal, this is the Van Nostrand door. We're on approach. Our tonnage is at 500k, fully laden. We're about half an hour out. Requesting a slot. Over.
Turgid redundantly scanned the grid layout. All the bays were empty. Still, he didn't need to advertise the fact. Van Nostrand door, you are clear to put down in Bay 3. See you in 30. Over and out. He replaced the handset and reached towards a carton of ciggies that sat on the top of the console. Before he could pull out a fresh packet, his radio crackled. He held it up and read the word internal on the display. Turgid sighed and pushed and held the receive button. What's up, Curly?
Easy, big dog, what's occurring?
Turgid rolled his eyes. Like all rich kids, Curly misappropriated the street slang of the mining class in a failed attempt to sound cool. It was embarrassing, although the fact he played along with it was somehow worse.
Just clocked that we got a freighter coming in. Help a brother out, will you, and do an exhaust port check before they arrive.
Turgid muttered an expletive under his breath, and his lips curled back from his teeth. I checked it at the start of the week, bro. It's clear. We've had synths working maintenance down there, grouting the surface area for the whole shift. It doesn't need doing.
Just humour me, bro. It's for the insurance. We're supposed to do it every time. Belt and braces.
I don't see why.
Because I fucking say so. Just help me out here.
Alright. I'm on it. Turgid grumpily slid off his seat and thumped the console hard in frustration. One of these days the whole thing would pack up under the strain of old food and blunt force trauma, and then he'd be forced to find another gig. Maybe he could apply for a posting on Oceanus Station. They had full crewing there, and real women. He scoffed at his own idea, like they'd ever let him anywhere near that place. He was too old, too out of shape, and his teeth were too yellow to even be considered Oceanus. He patted the extruding dome of his guts and wondered if he'd ever get back into going to the gym. He doubted it. The elevator clanked loudly as it reached the bottom of the shaft. Ground zero, the exhaust level. He hated it down here. There was no reason that the synths couldn't conduct port checks on their own, but then people Earthside might begin to take an interest in the way they ran things up here. Curly was keen to make sure the company auditors didn't get too close to the workings of this place. It might disturb his masturbation routine. So here he was, going through the motions of checking the ports for obstructions, loose tiling, residue build-ups or trespass. He couldn't even tell Curly that he'd do it and then bunk off because Curly could monitor him through the tunnel via CCTV. And he would. You could guarantee it. He lifted his radio receiver to his mouth. Curly, I'm going into the tunnel, about to lose comms. Anything you specifically want me to do in there?
You're negative, gangster. Just give it the once over, then you're free to get back to your biscuits.
Turgid replaced the radio on his belt. There was only one way in and out of the exhaust port. He set off towards the large titanium double doors that opened into the tunnel. He pulled a pass card out of his pocket that was attached to a lanyard and flashed it at a small screen by the side of the doorway. There was an affirmatory bleep, and the heavy doors slowly slid open with a deep thrum. He stepped through them, and they thrummed closed behind him. The exhaust port was a corridor, about 100 metres in length and 10 by 10 wide and high. It was lined on all sides with brown square tiles made from tungsten, copper and nickel. If any of these tiles came loose, the downdraft from a freighter's boosters could melt holes in the station's substructure and the whole place could slowly begin to fall apart. It could take seconds for a station to fold in on itself, sucking Curly, him, and everything else aboard this failing rig out into the freezing void. In his 9 years at Hyperion, a tile had never so much as wobbled, let alone come off. The engineering on these things was the absolute definition of solid. Of course, the density of the tiling also meant that no radio signals could penetrate the walls of this place, and even sound waves were dampened by the inner cladding. The whole place had a deadened, silent vibe to it. The colour of the tiles gave the place an appearance of being in some kind of enormous toilet pipe. This ambience wasn't helped by the intermittent lighting that dipped in the areas between the lights into dark shadow. He generally got his inspections done as quickly as he could. Turgid looked up at the first camera fastened into the wall above him. He unhooked the right shoulder strap of his dungarees, pulled down his pants, and mooned it. He knew Curly would find this passive-aggressive act funny. He then pulled everything back up, flicked the camera with a finger, stuck his tongue out, and carried on down the tunnel. This was annoying. What the hell did Curly care about maintenance anyway? Apart from placating the company, this whole rig was just a giant playpen to him before he went back earthside and bagged himself an executive position on the board of one of the mining firms. What a prick. He made a big show of looking around at the ceiling, walls and flooring, and occasionally gave a thumbs-up signal to the cameras that sat silently sunken in their wall brackets. Curly would be making sure he was carrying out his checks to the letter, so he gave him what he wanted. He reached the end of the tunnel and was satisfied that everything was exactly as it should have been. He knew it was. It had been 5 minutes, well, 4 days, since he'd been down here last, going through the same futile bullshit. They could suffer a direct hit from a displacement cannon and still not get a single fracture in the whole of the exhaust port. They built these installations to last. He cantered back up the tunnel, glad to be done with it, and practically skipped through the double doors. His radio crackled. Yes, Curly, all done. Everything looking good in there. You're very funny, Turgid. Who was the bloke? For a second, he didn't know what to say. That wasn't the answer he'd been expecting. What bloke? Curly sounded irritated. The bloke in the exhaust port, you plum. No flight crew are supposed to go anywhere near that deck. Have one of the freighters left crew behind on the station? Or was he one of your homies? Oh, sorry, Curly, I'm not following. Who are you talking about? I'm talking about the bloke that you saw in the tunnel. There was nobody in the tunnel. Turgid's face had crumpled into a picture of confusion. The tunnel inspection had been the same as it's always been. The whole place was empty. He didn't understand. Okay, joke's over. Get in there, get him out, whoever he is. I'm not going to be responsible for some knobhead getting rocket roasted on my watch. A confused Turgid headed back through the doors and into the tunnel. He stood for a second, looking down its entire length. Nothing. There was nobody there, as far as he could see, although his line of sight was obscured in certain areas by darkness. He looked at the first camera and gave an exaggerated shrug, offering his upturned palms to Curly in a gesture of futility. This was a pointless protest, but it was better than getting angry. Even though he rarely dished anything out, Curly was sanctioned to use punishment on the station if the situation warranted it. Turgid didn't fancy risking it. He set off again down the tunnel, this time really scanning the areas between the lights where shapes folded formlessly into the deep darkness. In a couple of minutes, he'd reached the end wall of the tunnel. He sighed, headed back to where he'd started, passing through the doors and back into radio contact with Curly. His radio immediately crackled to life. I told you there was nobody there, Curly cut him off. I don't know what you're playing at, gangster, but it ain't funny. Listen, man, you're really freaking me out here. There's nobody in that tunnel. You do realise I'm watching you on the CCTV, right? I can see everything. I watched him turn as you walked right past him. I can still see him now. He's about halfway down the tunnel. I swear down, bro, there's nobody in there. Don't fuck with me,
Turgid. I don't know what stupid game you're playing here, but if you don't get that bloke out of that tunnel, I will personally confine you to the brig and ship you Earthside on the next available shuttle. Breach of contract. No severance pay, no notice, no reference. Fuck all. You understand?
Turgid was nearly in tears now. What was he supposed to do? He checked the tunnel twice now and come up with nothing. He felt a mounting despair growing in him. He took a deep breath and headed back towards the tunnel. As he reached the doors, he was struck by an idea. Curly, I'm going to try and keep you on the radio this time. When I reach the place where the bloke is, you can let me know. Don't take the piss, Turgid. The comms can't pick up in the exhaust port. Let's just try it. Curly sighed.
Look, whatever, bro. Just get on with it.
Turgid steps through the doors and into the tunnel. He looks with trepidation at the first camera, fixes his eyes on the far end of the tunnel, and then reluctantly heads down it. The radio buzzes with static. Curly's voice cannot be heard. He forces himself to walk slowly through the dark areas that seem darker than ever, his eyes unable to discern any kind of form in the blackness, his imagination plugging the gaps in his vision with horrors that he stamps on quickly. His whole body is fizzing with anxiety, and all his nicotine-dulled senses are sharper than they've been in years. Nothing from the radio except white noise. He reaches the end of the tunnel. Nothing. He turns to head back, and as he does so, the radio's static output seems to subside a little. It must be Curly about to communicate something to him. He lifts the radio to his ear so as to hear the message clearer. But it's not Curly. I see you, says a voice through the static. Turgid is gripped with terror. His blood has gone thin and icy and is coursing through his tingling body like mercury. He feels rigid with fear but forces his legs to move. As he reaches the middle of the tunnel, he glances at the wall to his left. The words, "I see you," are scratched in a distorted, jagged font into the metal at head height. He breaks into a run, and the adrenaline pumping through his veins lends a desperate energy to his limbs. He's in sight of the double doors that lead back to the elevator, and relief begins to break in him, but as he gets within 10 meters of them, they slowly begin to close. They slide shut as he throws himself against them, fumbling for his lanyard. Sweet wrappers and lint falling to the ground at his feet. His fingers find the pass card, and in desperation he jams it against the small screen to the side of the door. No bleep. Nothing. Then all the lights go out. He slides down the door and into a fetal position. He grabs the back of his head and pulls it into his chest, shaking with fear. He freezes as he thinks he hears movement close to him. Up in the penthouse level, Curly was watching the CCTV on the bank of screens in front of him. He saw Turgid walking back down the tunnel, accompanied by whoever that was, losing sight of him as he left the frame. Then the tunnel lights went out. Well, that was odd. He ran a quick diagnostic on the circuit that spur was connected to, and it seemed fine. No problems. He ran a full systems check in case it was a reactor issue, but it came back negative. He tried Turgid on the radio and was met with a burst of static. The lights came back on. The tunnel was exactly how it had been. Turgid and the trespasser were gone. Finally. He'd felt a bit bad threatening Turgid like that, but Christ, the guy could be a real pain in the arse sometimes. I mean, he was all for practical jokes once in a while, but not when they were docking a craft. This was business, and there was little enough of it about right now. Still, he and Turgid were kind of friends. As much as you could be friends with a guy like him. He tried the radio again. Turgid, you reading me, bro? Yeah. Nice one. You got him out? Yeah, great. I appreciate you. Go on, let me on it. Who is he? A few silent seconds ticked by. Then the answer came through. All good here. We're coming up. Weird, thought Curly. Turgid didn't sound like himself. Maybe he really was still pissed at him for not seeing the funny side of the joke. Never mind. He would smooth things over with another carton of cigarettes and an enhanced biscuit ration for Turgid. He sighed, stretched out his arms and yawned, levering himself out of the big comfortable chair. He did up his belt, zipped up his flies, as he walked to the elevator doors and waited. The whirring of the cables eventually gave way to a clank as the capsule slowly docked into position in the shaft. A second or two elapsed before the doors opened. He smiled in anticipation of having to placate Turgid and his unknown friend. Then the doors rolled back, and Curly's smile turned into a scream. You have been listening to The Docking Marshal, written and read by Rob Whitelock. Copyright Rob Whitelock, 2026.